Heidegger's monumental work, Being in Time and the Quest for Being, addressed through a fundamental ontology and existential analytics of Dasein. And Dasein, I can't stress this enough, that's us. Dasein is you and me. We are, as such, a thrown project, usually, if not most of the time, lost in the day. First example given, considering the importance of being in time for our lives, is the difference between authentic and inauthentic temporality. In inauthentic temporality, we consider the past as something that is behind us. What's done is done. Water under a bridge. No use crying over spilled milk. That is the language of the day concerning the past. The past is history. The present, inauthentically seen, is the measurable now. A couple of minutes past 6, that is now. Aristotle even said, time is the succession of moments. I think that is an inauthentic way of thinking about time. And the future is inauthentically come what may. Authentically, the past, so in authentic temporality, the past is not behind us, but is constantly retrieved, embraced anew. Heidegger uses the word Wiederholung, repetition, but it's not a strict repetition. Even one of the major books by Kierkegaard is called Repetition. It is a constant reinterpreting, re-embracing of the past, rewriting your past. That is inauthentic. That is the authentic attitude towards the past. The present, authentically speaking, is the moment of decision. It is the moment of decision, das Augenblick, the moment, the instant in which you embrace your life, your present, but also while retrieving your past and considering the future not as come what may, but as being your possibility, your being towards death ultimately. Second, another example is Heidegger's completely new view on psychiatry. Heidegger's influence on psychiatry is immense. Actually, I think he caused the whole movement of the anti-psychiatry in the 60s and 70s, and more specific today, the movement of existential psychiatry or existential therapy. All so-called mental diseases are actually specific thrown projects. So a depression is your way of dealing with your thrownness. A psychosis is someone's way of dealing with his or her thrownness. Now, some of you may have been diagnosed by scrupulous psychiatrists within DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That is the language of the day. That is the language which tries to tell you what you are. But in fact, all these mental diseases are individual articulations of your thrown projectiveness. We call, even DSM calls mental diseases disorders. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why we call them disorders. Because they disrupt the order of the day. That's why we call them disorders. They challenge the order of the day. And I'd like to remind you of the wise words of Robert Musil in The Man Without Qualities, also on my list. The only difference between the mentally sane and the mentally insane is that the mentally sane have all mental diseases and the mentally insane only one. We are all sad, we're all afraid, we're all worried, we're all suspicious. We all have all mental illnesses in our lives. It's all about existing. It's all about modes of existence. So even mental illnesses are primarily modes of existence. We should remember that. It's all about existing. This is also what resoluteness is all about, authenticity. Authenticity is not about heroics and not about personal growth. Authenticity is embracing your unconcealment, embracing your thrownness, rising to the occasion of your being there, beyond the day, And mind you, for Heidegger, there's no prescription in authenticity. There is no such thing as authenticity that it can be taught at the school of life, although they try, and you pay well for it. There is no ethics in being in time. There is no refuge in the they if you really embrace your existence. Now, apparently we're talking about freedom here, and we're talking about responsibility here in a completely new way. And this is exactly where Jean-Paul Sartre comes in.
Welcome, dear listener. My name is Kas Molenaar.
My name is Sonia Kas.
And welcome back to First Philosophy.
Yeah, we have a treat today.
We do. We truly do.
I hear some sarcasm, but we'll get to that.
No.
No, but of course, last couple of episodes we've been really dwelling on Heidegger, and we've been really trying to get into meat and potatoes of it. And I have good news to the listeners. I think this episode is a bit more relaxed. You don't need to feel like you have to make notes to get this one.
I agree. And we ended the last episode. We already mentioned that the Heidegger was more about the structures, and that also that we and also Awee were kind of slipping into filling in these structures, and this will now be done even more so by Jean-Paul Sartre, our philosopher of today.
Philosopher of the week, JP. Big JP. Which people have opinions. Everyone has opinions on Sartre.
Yeah.
And we need to address the elephant in the room. You've already expressed before your dislike for the guy.
Yeah, and that I kind of regret that now with the intensity with which I did that, because let's give him a fair shot at it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. But I can't help but be extremely partial to him because, I don't know, the school that I went to, there was this funny tangent around the time when I was like 14, 15, it was kind of, in a way, cool to start getting into like art house cinema and the big thing. And, kind of that archetype was becoming really, really nice. So as a bookish kid, it felt nice that I could fit somehow in like a respectable, school strata. And a very big thing, the central literature of this social formation was reading Sartre's Nausea. So there was this pandemic in the school of 14-year-olds reading Nausea and then like trying to understand it. And I partook. So, and it was probably my first philosophical text ever.
But I think that's wonderful. I really do. And it is a very good book to start with if you want to read philosophy.
Yeah.
It's a work of literature, so it's not like academic work. Mm-hmm. It is fairly challenging still, but I think it's a very good entry point. If you want to start reading philosophy and you're kind of frightened by academic works, start with Nausea.
So for you, it's either Nausea or Zuinzeit. Two entry points in philosophy.
No, for us, it's L'étrangère.
Yeah, I already... I confessed my love for Camus to Sonia recently, which has been deemed my most bisexual opinion. Well, so, and I think it's good to not dwell too much on my personal preference at this point. Like I'm on the next episode, when we're concluding Sartre, I'll say a few things on the matter. But what I'll say now is that one of my first encounters with philosophy that I found really inspiring was with Sartre. Partially, I think now I do not like him as much as I used to do because I found a lot of other philosophers that like filled in blanks that I found in Sartre. But that it's also unfair to completely dismiss him. And I think as an entry point in philosophy, Sartre is in a way fantastic.
Yeah.
Sure.
Also very powerful like
Yeah.
meaning when someone says something like, okay, radical freedom, you're so responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that point, if you've never heard of this before, you're like, he said what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that meeting is actually very strong, and also that way I think it's a very good entry point to philosophy.
I completely agree. And this is also the one of the things that was so freeing, and I mean, attentive listeners will maybe notice that this is also what I really enjoyed in Heidegger, and I got familiar with Heidegger after my first encounter with Sartre. So you fill in the blanks yourself there. But the thing that your essence doesn't get predetermined. And that essence is not something that is put upon you. And I mean, our producer asked me to use this hook to keep the podcast also a bit, well,
Exciting.
keep it exciting, use a hook. But I think a good entry point into the philosophy of Sartre, a very good enticer, is just the tagline, "You won't believe what precedes essence."
So today's lecture first addresses the life and works of Jean-Paul Sartre, best known as the founding father of existentialism. Now, when we speak of existentialism, we must first distance ourselves from a well-known and persistent caricature, the existentialist. According to his critics, the existentialist spends most of his days and nights in the bars and cafés of Paris Saint-Germain. Actually, Sartre worked there and met his friends in Café de Flore, which is a bar in Paris and still a place of pilgrimage. Please visit it. And there's the existentialist, wearing a black turtleneck sweater and a black leather coat. You may notice I tried to dress up a bit for the occasion. Incessantly drinking red wine, smoking Gauloise cigarettes, preferably surrounded by lots of women, loudly loathing the bourgeoisie while preparing the suicide he will never commit. In the 60s, there was this little booklet which was called "I'm okay, you're okay." Any existentialist would rewrite, "I'm not okay, but you're not okay at all." That is the caricature of the existentialist. Now, it is of great importance that we put this caricature aside and acknowledge the philosophical significance of existentialism, because you may deny, but you cannot avoid the perils and anguishes of personal existence. It's not easy to be in existence. My oldest friend and best enemy, Henk Oosterling, and I wrote a little booklet called Existentialism and Humanism in Postmodern Times, in which we try to raise the question, what is happening to existentialism and humanism in our days? And the preface was called Beyond Heartburn, in Dutch, de ren is voorbij, which means that there's something that you can't take pills for. The heartburn existentialism will always give you. After Nietzsche, we are in peril. One of those perils I will address this Thursday in the class on the later Heidegger, how we try to commodify and ease our lives in comfortable nihilism. But there's also the experience of nihilism, the death of God. There's no truth, no ultimate value, no ultimate goal in life. And how do you deal with this? There is this great remark of Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, where Ivan says and exclaims, "If God is dead, everything is permitted." That is the true experience of nihilism. If God is dead, if there is no ultimate truth, no ultimate value, no ultimate goal in life, then everything is permitted. So we're talking about a huge responsibility that is caused by this experience of the death of God. With Jean-Paul Sartre, phenomenology moves to France. Both Husserl and Heidegger drastically changed the philosophical landscape of the 20th century. Without Husserl and Heidegger, no Gadamer, no Foucault, no Ricoeur, no Derrida, no Vattimo, no Deleuze, no Agamben, no Sloterdijk, etc., etc., etc. We must note, however, that Husserl's influence is usually only acknowledged for his critique of the natural attitude. the attitude of the sciences, the alleged evidence-based sciences, only dealing with facts and objects and never truly addressing the fullness of the life world. But Husserl's phenomenological reduction hardly found any followers. It is therefore remarkable that Sartre focuses on Husserl's analysis of consciousness and the phenomenon of intentionality. And even more important to note, by doing so, he tried to radicalize and humanize Heidegger's existential analytics. So brace yourselves. First, a small introduction. When phenomenology moved to France, it found fertile soil in pre-existential and pre-phenomenological philosophy. Philosophy in Germany after Kant was either mainly an exercise in epistemology, so theories of knowledge, or in Hegelian style, a series of efforts to build new philosophical systems, exploring new possibilities for metaphysics. In France, a phenomenology of human existence, the first-person perspective, finds predecessors in, I just mentioned a few, 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne. His essays, the motto of his essays was, "Que sais-je? What do I know? But what do I know about myself?" These are essays on himself, on his life, on his passions, on his fears, 1,000 pages of merciless and honest self-analysis. That is Montaigne. In the 17th century, there's Blaise Pascal, contemporary of Descartes, who wrote, "The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing." And you will experience this in your life time and time again. The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. The primacy of the ego cogito is an exaggeration. Pascal is also the one who offered a scrutinous picture of the condition humaine, the human condition. Actually, it was Pascal who coined this idiom of the human condition, later used by Hannah Arendt, and we use it in plural for our classes. What is the condition humaine? What is the human condition according to Pascal? It is this: inquiétude, divertissement, ennui. So first, this is our condition, your condition, my condition. Restlessness, constant discomfort. That's the first we started. Constant in our lives, we feel this: restlessness, discomfort. We're not happy with what we are, how we are, where we are. Second, seeking diversion, seeking entertainment, divertissement. And finally, thirdly, always this: boredom, ennui. Always boredom at the end of everything. Pascal sketched us the misery of the king. When you're a king, Pascal says, you always have to be entertained. You always have to be entertained. Because a king, although he may be 1,000-time king, tout roi qu'il est, cannot sit still alone in a room. And we, contemporary kings, we have about all the things the kings had by then, are also in this condition of restlessness, seeking for entertainment, and suffering from boredom. Then there is, in the 18th century, Rousseau, whose confessions were candid and very shameless and completely honest self-analysis, self-criticism, far worse than St. Augustine had ever dared to write down. In the 18th century, you also had the salon, the places where people met, the salon de Madame Buffon, where Voltaire, La Rochefoucauld, all the others met and talked about what it means to be a human being. There's this wonderful book also on the list by Voltaire, De Candide. Leibniz once said, this world is the best world possible because God will never make God had to work with the material he had, but this world must be metaphysically the best of all possible worlds because God, in his greatness and goodness, did the best he could. And Candide says, well, and the book Candide is about people seeking for happiness, El Dorado, find happiness in this world, and they go through the worst catastrophes, and finally they find El Dorado, where children are playing with marbles made of diamonds, and everybody has everything, and they end up so fucking bored they can't even breathe from boredom. So they were really asking the question. Le Maistre once said, "What is man? What is man?" I never met him. I never met men. I met Persian people. I met people from all over the world, but I never met men. And the Dutch author Gerard Reven once said, "Man, could you please give me his address and telephone number?" Yeah? This is what you may like this because this is what you've done in your thesis too. Just showing how philosophy is actually so ridiculous, asking what is man. So there was fertile soil for explorations in the first person perspective in France. So as a young man, Sartre studied the works of Heidegger and Husserl in Berlin. So he never attended class because he was in Berlin and Heidegger and Husserl were in Freiburg and Marburg. And he was fascinated by Husserl and Heidegger. So Husserl insisted on the endless creativity of the transcendental consciousness, constituting, through thinking, all real and possible worlds. That's what consciousness is doing. Sartre criticizes Husserl. He says, Husserl loses the world. Being is absorbed by consciousness. Sein gets lost in Bewusstsein. In Husserl's thinking, the world evaporates, it vanishes in mental acts. Where are the passions? Where's the suffering? Where's the hunger, the longing? What happened to sex in the phenomenological reduction? Yet, to Sartre, the peculiar movement of intentionality remains an inspiring phenomenon for him. We are always directed towards. And concerning Heidegger, he read in Being and Time how Heidegger insists on formal indication. So he only tries to write about the existential structures of existence, that we are a throne project. All that Heidegger does is categoristize, just tell his reader straight in the face what it means to exist, without any guidelines, without any comforting truths, with no resort, no ethics, no solutions. And Sartre says there's something wrong with this book. Something wrong with this book. It can easily be read as just another sterile academic endeavor. All Heidegger does is just describing structures. In fact, when I studied philosophy, Being in Time was, in fact, presented to me as a young student as an exercise in philosophical anthropology. They didn't understand what Heidegger was doing. But on the other hand, what Heidegger was doing can indeed be read as an abstract endeavor. Sartre read Being in Time when he was incarcerated at the beginning of the Second World War in a prisoner of war camp. They arrested when they occupied France. Many civilians, also Sartre was arrested. He was in this camp and he read Being in Time and he was fascinated with it. He was fascinated, but he said, I want to understand what is really happening in this book. Okay, he says, I am a throne projection, a throne project. But what does this really mean? What do freedom and responsibility mean for a throne project who is really existing in the world? Not just reading Heidegger, but existing in the world. And he says Heidegger describes the they as a positive choice. I can decide to embrace my life, my existence, but I can also decide, it's a positive choice, not to embrace my existence as a throne project, but live according to the they. And I consider myself an animal rational or whatever I feel comfortable with. Sartre says it's worse than that. It's worse than that. The they, that's the bastards, the salauds, the klootzakken. The they are these terrible, terrible people that take everything serious except their own existence. They take everything serious. Oh, they're so worried about the results of the election and what's going to happen. Oh, what do you see there in the world? Oh, catastrophes all around. But they don't consider themselves really as a throne project with all the responsibility that comes with it. And we're going to look into this. We're going to look into this. Heidegger solved the problem of intersubjectivity by saying, no, it's not about Einfühlung or whatever is happening between people. People are Mitsein. People are already with each other all the time, even when they're alone. Sartre says, no, it's not as easy as that. That's abstract. If I just live, I experience that hell is other people. Other people are hell. Other people are constantly labeling me. This is Kierkegaard again. What labels me negates me. What is happening between people is a constant conflict of people having a certain perspective on each other and reducing the other from this perspective to what they think the other is. So drama enters the scenery of phenomenology here. This is what happens in Sartre. For Heidegger, it was all about an existential approach, structures, no existential analysis. It's just the grammar of existence, and then it's up to the reader to embrace what has been told here. Existentialism could be considered as a phenomenology of existential. So exactly what Heidegger didn't want to do, Sartre is doing. And Sartre even said, Heidegger n'a pas de caractère. It sounds good in French. He doesn't have any character. He just describes structures. He doesn't really take his responsibility. He doesn't even understand what responsibility and freedom are. And what Sartre also stresses is that Heidegger neglects the historical existential situation in which he was writing, between World War I and World War II. The world was in peril. The world was in confusion. Karl Jaspers, a friend, colleague of Heidegger, coined the idiom of Grenzerfahrungen, so boundary experiences or borderline experiences. There are experiences that can overcome you, in which you don't understand, in which reason can't grasp what is happening there. Anxiety is one of those borderline experiences. In anxiety, everything loses its meaning, in Heidegger also, and I just experience myself as a thrown projection as such. So there's no understanding there. But Jasper said also guilt. The guilt of what you've done, what people had done in the trenches to each other in the First World War. Their despair, confusion, contingency, nihilism. These are not philosophical concepts. Very important to note. Philosophy tries to make everything into philosophy. It shouldn't. Philosophy should be courageous enough to understand that phenomena like anxiety, guilt, despair, confusion, nihilism are not philosophical concepts. They are precarious human conditions. When Ivan Karamazov says, when God is dead, everything is permitted, everything is allowed. So you might say nihilism, God is dead. Ooh, I'm a philosopher, I declare God to be dead. You have to understand, of course, Sartre Dostoevsky was an early existentialist. The implications, when God is dead, everything is allowed. How to deal with that. And Sartre wants to convince his reader that existentialism is as courageous as it is human, or humanist even. This was expressed in his famous manifesto, very small booklet, very easy to read, L'existentialisme est un humanisme. Existentialism is a humanism. It was published in 1946. There was a lecture in 1945, just after the war, and there was in a rather big hall where Sartre gave the lecture, but there were thousands and thousands of people in the streets trying to get in and listen to this lecture where Sartre was explaining that existentialism, embracing nihilism, embracing that nothing and no one can help you in finding your way in existence, is the ultimate humanist, people-loving position.
Awee has been talking quite a lot and referring to the booklets, kind of, by Sartre. Existentialism is a humanism. And I think it makes sense for us to dwell a little bit on, why are we talking about humanism? Why is it relevant? What is humanism as well? So basically, I just maybe want to provide some context because That's something I'm interested in. And an important disclaimer is that I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian of philosophy, and I don't pretend to be on the expert level of knowledge. However, from the impressions that I have, that I think in many ways make sense, they just might be not as nuanced as someone with more experience and knowledge would put it. But for quite obvious reasons, if we remember what happened in the 20th century, there was this kind of crisis of humanism. And I think there was this real attempt after the horrors of the Second World War and, the bombing, of course, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki there was a big bafflement, like, how the hell could this ever happen? This is insane. Yeah. And so then there were attempts to think about how this happened. And I think that really triggered a lot of thinking of humanism and kind of like trying to regain it and trying to bring it back, because maybe there was this kind of intuition that we've lost the person somewhere along the way. And so in this way, and I encourage everyone actually to read, indeed, Existentialism is a Humanism. It's a short book, and it's written in a very approachable way. It was meant to be read very widely.
No, yeah, and like Awee said in this lecture, it was a reading.
Yeah,
it was
exactly.
a reading of public philosophy.
Yeah, and so I do encourage everyone to read it and maybe see if you agree with me that, to me, the premise of it is that he is justifying existentialism. But I think I get the feeling that he's really justifying humanism. The intended the proclaimed goal is to show why existentialism is valid and is interesting, and blah, blah. But I really think it almost defends humanism more in the end, which I think is an interesting way to approach this text. And maybe to expand a little bit on what exactly I'm saying the booklet is defending. Sartre, really towards the end of the text, finally says what is humanism, what he means by it. And he distinguishes two types of humanism, one of them bad, something that he's not advocating for, one of them good. And so he said there are two different types of humanism. By the first one, the quote-unquote bad one, he takes a theory, and I'm almost quoting, I think, a theory that takes man as an end and as a supreme value. And he says it is bad because for Sartre and for existentialism, a man is constantly in the making. It's never a finished project. And he and this is where we come to trying to get back at humanism after the horrors of the wars. Sartre says that this first kind of theoretical structure leads to fascism. Yes. So it's very serious for him. Yeah. And what he contrasts to that, the quote-unquote good humanism, he says that man, and here once again I'm almost directly quoting, man is always outside of himself, and it is in projecting and losing himself beyond himself that man is realized. It is in pursuing transcendent goals that he is able to exist. Man himself is the core and focus of this transcendence. And this is very important, I think. The only universe that exists is the human one, the universe of human subjectivity. So this is the good humanism for Sartre, the one that doesn't lead to fascism. And interestingly, I think especially with this last sentence, you can really see the Heidegger influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Only with the blanks filled in, so it's not just the description of a structure. Yeah. And I think this is a very good move. This is an important step you can take.
Yeah, also in terms of trying to rectify something that's, I mean, you're forced to grapple with, quote, the everyday evil that has just happened. And you arguably can't really, and this is also what Awee talks about, you can't really prevent people from, open their eyes to the everyday evil just by talking about structures.
No, and I think it's also the anecdote that so many people were standing in line that that Sartre allegedly couldn't even make it to the stage at first because there were too many people like packed to the rafters to hear him speak on this subject. Also really shows that people were desperate for this kind of story in a way.
Yeah.
And I can only affirm that it is reading the text, Existentialism is a Humanism, is very accessible. Like if we talked about nausea already, and that is a very good entry point. But that is literature, and if you want to read like a structured, more academic or like philosophical, non-literary point, I think this is excellent to start. It's a very good, a very, very good entry point. Also because he explains in brief other thinkers in the text. So he points to Kierkegaard, he points to Heidegger, and it's I would say it's a very natural next step after listening to this episode to like pick up the booklet at your local bookstore and start delving into this text, because it is really well written, well put, well contextualized. And it gives a very good entry point into existentialism in general. Yeah. Another book that Awee mentions during this lecture is Candide by Voltaire. And I would just like to restate that is a fantastic book. Like it is horrible, but it's also because the horrible things happen. Yeah. But it is to make a point. It is to also show in a certain way the limits of a certain kind of philosophy, and it is the list that Awee sends out to students, like these are books you should read. I believe it's on there. And at one time I was struggling with a few things academically and with the paper, and Awee just sent me an email. It was a very, very kind email, and he closed off with a citation from the last page of Candide, which was, "Let us work without arguing. It is the only way to make life bearable."
Beautiful.
It's like we should just get to work. Yeah. We just get to work for now. We'll argue later. The quote was meant in multiple ways. I was kind of like falling down a spiral with all the things that I had to do and worrying about him. It was kind of just start working, but also it is a lot, isn't it? It's and the sentence is very, very funny also in the context of the story. I would recommend anyone read the book. Like read these 3 books we've mentioned: Nausea, Existentialism is a Humanism.
By next week,
we want reports on our desks. So let's move away from these book tips and get back into Sartre's work and Sartre's life.
Sartre's life, importantly.
Now let's look at Sartre's life briefly. Like Kierkegaard, you can't escape talking about Sartre's life. He was born in 1905, and when Sartre was only 2 years old, his father died. And in his autobiography, Les Mots, the words, Sartre said, "That's the best thing that ever happened to me, that my father died. That was a wonderful thing. I never had to develop an Oedipus complex," which is the idea of Freud that every young boy wants to consciously or subconsciously kill his father. And I never have developed a superego, because I didn't have a dad. I never developed a superego. Well, I think it's a nice twist to something so tragic, and he may be right. I don't know. Sartre studied in Paris at the famous École Normale Supérieure, the highest institute of academic excellence in France, where he met Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and many others. And then he became, like many do in France, after graduating in philosophy, he became a high school teacher and a writer. And this is very important. The importance of art, of literature, for philosophy. Many critics, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, never took Sartre serious as a philosopher. They said, Eyre, even, he is one of the prominent analytic philosophers, called the book Sartre, Novelist Philosopher. The same went for Nietzsche. For many decades, even in the 60s, 70s, even when I started to study philosophy, my professor said Nietzsche is not a philosopher. He's an author. He's a writer. He's not a real philosopher. It's some way of getting rid of the inconvenience of philosophers. But in fact, they should have realized that this is a compliment that you can also do literature. That doesn't mean that they can write nice and that it's nice to read them, because in fact, it's not very easy to read Sartre. He was a great fan of amphetamine. So all his books are this thick, and you can sometimes get the feeling that he was more under the influence than talking about his subject. No, that's not fair. That's not fair, because his books are brilliant. In fact, Sartre is still one of the most popular and famous philosophers at the moment. So he was also a writer, and I will illustrate this. What art and literature can do. Art and literature are an articulation of philosophical intuitions. This is where, if you read his first bundle of stories, The Wall, the title story is about a group of resistance fighters during the Spanish Civil War who are captured by the fascists and are about to be executed. And before they are executed, there is a psychologist who comes to look at them, to write a scientific treatise on what people think and do when they know they're going to die the next day. The main character of the story, maybe Sartre, I don't know how he pictured it, tries to play with his psychologist, and he also plays with his interrogators, because at a certain moment, when the others are all executed, they come to him and they say, if you tell us where Ramon Gris is, the head of the local resistance, if you tell us where Ramon Gris is, we'll set you free. We'll set you free, we promise. Of course, you never know. But there's a chance, and so he decides to play with them. He knows that Ramon Gris is hidden in a theater, in the basement of the local theater. So all of a sudden he says, okay, I want to be free, I want to get free, I'll tell you. He's hidden at the cemetery. We hid him at the cemetery. And he sees the cars, the army driving away to capture Ramon Gris, and he sits there crying and laughing at the same time, because he played fools with his interrogators, and he knows he's going to be shot, but he had this small part of resistance, this small part of liberty that he could still embrace. And then all of a sudden, this captain of the army comes into his cell and he says, you can go, you're free to go, you're free to go. And he walks into the village, he doesn't know what's happening to him. And then he meets some people who come up to him and and tell him, have you heard? We were worried about the location where we hid Ramon Gris. We thought the theater was not safe anymore, so we decided to hide him at the cemetery, where he was found. Now, this is an experience, you will agree, of the absurdity of existence, the absurdity of contingency. And if telling this in a story really brings it into experience. This is not philosophy talking about things, but this is really addressing a problem, a phenomenon, directly in literature. This is the importance of literature for philosophy. And it discloses human existence in a far more direct way. Many years ago, I wrote a book on boredom, outpervading, being bored, it should be translated, and very well, big success. I was a wealthy man for a while, but I still prefer Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or Goncharov's Oblomov to my own work. Because in these books, you really experience what boredom is, how boredom works. It discloses boredom instead of what I've been doing. Well, sometimes I've succeeded a little bit in doing better than that, but showing all the various dimensions and the ontology of boredom. So literature discloses the world art does, in a very direct way. The importance of art and literature for philosophy can never, never, ever be underestimated. Sartre's philosophy is actually filled with literature, filled with examples, with descriptions, which may be called literature. But then, during the Second World War in 1943, he published Being and Nothingness, his big book, Being and Nothingness. You might say that sounds like being and time. He's probably alluding to Heidegger's work. Being and nothingness, being and time. No, Sartre goes his own way. Being and time is about two modes of being. There are two modes of being, Sartre says. The for itself, the pour soi, which we would call consciousness. So he's very like Husserl here. There's consciousness, the for itself, the English translation of Sartre's idiom pour soi, the pour soi. And on the other hand, there's being as the in itself, the en soi, which is the world of objects. So there's consciousness on one hand and the world of objects on the other. And this reminds us of Descartes. It seems as if Sartre is doing the same thing Descartes did. Descartes said there's two substances. The res cogitans, the thinking mind, that is a substance. And there is the outside world, the res extensa, which is only existing as objects. But Sartre says, I'm not doing metaphysics like Descartes. I'm not doing it at all. I'm just doing phenomenology. I'm just showing what shows itself from itself. And what I see are two phenomenologically, fundamentally different modes of being. There is the pour soi, consciousness, which is what it is not, and which is not what it is. We already addressed this. Consciousness is what it is, but it's also what it is not, because it's also always directed towards something else. This purely intentional direction outwards, that is what consciousness is. While the things, the en soi, the other realm of being, is massive. There's no secret, no intentionality, nothing there, nothing. It's just objects, things. And Sartre even addresses this phenomena, this kind of being, in a novel called Nausea, La Nausée, Disgust. And there's the moment where the protagonist of the story sits in a park and he sees some pebbles with mud on it, and he picks them up and he looks at these pebbles with mud and he realizes the abyss, I use the word also that Husserl uses, the fundamental abyss between his thoughts, which go everywhere. He's longing for a woman, he's thinking about his past, he's regretting all kinds of things. That is what he is. He's pour soi. And then he sees this pebble with these muddy, sticky grains of sand on it, and he feels disgust. This is a realm of being that is so completely different to what I am really am as a consciousness. Now, what is the ontological status of this pour soi, of this consciousness? Like Husserl, Sartre says it's acts. It's purely mental acts. There are only mental acts. Consciousness is not a substance. There is no thing, not a thing that we can call consciousness. It's just the flow. And Sartre gives an example. A man sits in a bar. All Sartre's examples are from cafés and bars. A man sits in a bar and he's counting his cigarettes in a package. Someone walks up to him and says, "What you doing?" He wants to know what he's doing. The answer, "I am counting my cigarettes." That's very funny. There was no I, no ego, when this guy was counting. There was just the intentional act of counting cigarettes. There was no I. Only in a secondary movement, I can constitute something like an ego, like a consciousness. The consciousness self is just being conscious. So there is something that we may call a pre-reflexive cogito, just to stay a bit in the neighborhood of Husserl and Sartre and Descartes. But this pre-reflexive cogito or consciousness precedes reflective consciousness. Yeah? So reflective consciousness is secondary. It only happens sometimes. We have to realize, and this is Sartre's great discovery, you can see that it's also in Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty agrees with it. The existence of thought precedes our thinking about existence. So the existence of our thinking, counting the cigarettes, precedes our thinking about existence. Consciousness is not given, it's not pre-given. So, Husserl, according to Sartre, was, like Descartes, phenomenologically wrong in positing transcendental subjectivity. He was wrong. There is no such thing as transcendental subjectivity. There only is this, phenomenologically speaking, the mental acts, nothing else. Only the acts, and apart from that, consciousness is nothing. We'll come back to that later. Of course, I can objectify. I can, of course, have a reflective moment. When I'm conscious of all things, I can also become conscious of my own consciousness. That's why Sartre once published one of his booklets. It's called "The I, the Ego, is a Thing." We just make ourselves into a thing, but that is not the original movement of thinking. The original movement of thinking is this, only these mental acts. Secondly, Husserl was wrong in denying or parenthesizing the solidity of the world. Hence, this. I can parenthesize what I want, but that is just an intellectual endeavor. This is just there. We have to acknowledge the solidity, the stamina of the objects. So the title, Being and Nothingness, refers to being, that is reality, solid as a rock, indifferent, it's just there, and nothingness, which is consciousness. So there's no ontological difference in Sartre. He's not doing what Heidegger's doing. Not at all. He just thinks it's of no interest to him. The whole Heideggerian enterprise of the ontological difference. This is what we have: solid being, and this peculiar capacity of this strange being, what humans have, is that they have these mental acts constantly directed towards the world. Now, Sartre focuses on what he considers the most remarkable feature of mental acts, and exit Husserl here. For Husserl, all mental acts are ultimately to be considered as part of the great endeavor of transcendental subjectivity, constituting all real and possible worlds. Out. Sartre says that's not the point. There's something very, very peculiar about consciousness, and that is that it can negate. Sartre calls it néantiser, which is not a French word. Just like Heidegger, he prefers neologisms because he says, I'm writing about something that no one has ever seen before. So I have to find my own words to show what I'm saying. To negate or to nihilate is not to annihilate. It's not to destruct it. It's, in the Dutch translation of néantiser would be vernieten, which is not a Dutch word. Vernieten. Actually, it means bringing nothingnesses in the world. That is the most peculiar thing that human beings do. They bring nothingnesses in the world. And it's very simple, and don't think that I'm going to talk about something very difficult. This is something that happens all the time. Imagine I'm walking into a bar. I shouldn't do that, but I'll do anything for philosophy. So I'm walking into this bar, and I'm looking for my friend Paul. So I enter the bar. I see the barman behind the bar, not Paul. Strange. I see the sad drunks at the bar, not Paul, fortunately. I see the happy couples at their tables in the bar, not Paul. I see the shady losers lingering by the ladies' lavatory. Not Paul. So everything in that bar is not Paul. That's very strange. But Sartre says it's a reality. It's a reality. I'll give you a personal example. Maybe I shouldn't. A couple of years ago, my wife died. And it was for many years, even still, when I meet a woman, she's not Jacqueline. Wherever I go, it's the place where Jacqueline is not. Now, I'm not trying to bore you with my personal predicaments, and it's not. This is something that you all realize. Every one of you who had suffered a loss experiences this. That this spreading nothingnesses in the world is something that really happens, and I'm now talking about a rather sad predicament, but we should understand the ontological condition that it entails. So what is the meaning and the content of these products, these projects of néantiser, of negating? It is a world filled with nothingnesses. Néantité, in Dutch, nietheden. New words. Sartre is right. Phenomenologically speaking, it's great what he's doing. We are all not at home at the moment. That's definitely a reality. Being here, we're not at home. And there's so many not we can mention. It's incredible. This vast phenomenon, creating nothingnesses, spreading nothingnesses in the world. And Sartre says, how shall I call this? And he says, I find the answer. I call it freedom. It's freedom. That's a peculiar definition of freedom. We usually have rather naive and simple interpretation of freedom. As Isaiah Berlin, a respectable philosopher, once said, there's positive freedom, positive liberty, that is the power and the resources to fulfill your potential, and there's negative liberty, or negative freedom, that is that there are no restraints no external restraints to fulfill these potentials. Sartre says that is as naive as it is comfortable. It's so much more complex. Sartre criticizes all these ideas of freedom, and he says we are free, we are freedom, we are possibility, we are our own possibilities, our own projects. This is what we really should understand. We are, and he doesn't walk away from dramatic formulations, we are doomed to be free, condemned to be free. And as being condemned to be free, we are completely responsible for the world. Dostoevsky once wrote, I already quoted it in another class, we are responsible for everything towards everybody. Sartre quotes it. Simone de Beauvoir quotes it extensively. It's one of the quotes of one of her books.
So, at this point, I think this is one of the most obvious and the strongest convergence of philosophy and literature. We have been talking about it a lot, and Awee has been pointing it out a lot. And I hope it has been made clear why. Like especially in this episode, Awee is talking beautifully on the way literature and philosophy inform each other, or maybe even that philosophy needs literature.
Yeah.
It is not just like literature as a side project next to philosophy. No, like philosophy needs good literature.
Yeah.
And I Sartre is a very obvious candidate to show why that is. The story of Lemur that has been talked about is very clear. Also, his autobiography. There are very clear indications that Sartre's philosophy thrives through his literature.
Yeah, and I would even say, when you come to the bookstore, I have a big gripe with how many bookstores approach their philosophy sections. A lot of we already talked about the School of Life last episode, and about kind of expressed our disdain to it, and that is of course something that does actually end up in the philosophy section. But I think a lot of the things that you frequently find there is. And it's not a bad thing, but a lot of it is not philosophy. It's maybe cultural theory or like media analysis, which is great and good, but not necessarily philosophy.
No.
And so in an interesting way, there is way more philosophy to be found in just something that we plainly consider literature, compared to some authors like Alain de Botton, where you might be confused about what you're reading, thinking is philosophy, but
agree.
actually just kind of musings.
Yeah. No, and not to be mean about this, but pointing to someone's idea and saying that is philosophy, that in itself is not doing philosophy, and that is not necessarily teaching you anything. It is being thrown into these stories, being thrown into these concepts. That comes way closer to doing philosophy than listening to someone say, this is philosophy.
Yeah, and this is how you should think about it.
And that is like the entire span of this lecture series is the phenomenological method. It's not the phenomenological school that teaches you this is philosophy and this is how you should do it. It is a method that is constantly being put in different ways by different philosophers and different authors. Also, at different points in one author's life in different ways. It is a way of approaching life, a way of approaching science, a way of approaching philosophy, a way of approaching literature that is so rich and has so many aspects that it and I hope that this is not just. I hope that these lectures are not just being informative, but are also like a call to action.
Yeah.
In a way.
And since, this is also the last time, really, that we dwell properly on the literature-philosophy pairing, I thought it would be nice for us to indulge once again and maybe share one each, sort of philosophical author, philosophy author, however you want to call it. But, with exception of Dostoevsky and Kafka, that would be cheating. We've already talked about them a lot.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, Kas, is there a name?
Well, we already hinted at least at the works of Camus at the beginning of this episode. And I do think these books are very, very good to read. It is not high-level philosophy. They're very accessible. The philosophical point can sometimes be a bit difficult to find because the stories are not very, very obvious all of the time. But I think that's good. I think these are very good books to just pick up and read and like dwell on for a little while. Like I think The Stranger, L'Étranger, is a strange book. If you read it for the first time, you don't really know what to expect and what to make of it. I think the same goes for The Fall, The Chute. I think that's specifically The Fall are just a couple of monologues from a guy. And what do you do with this? Where do you go from this? And I think those are very good questions to be stuck with. Yeah. If I have to pick one, and also one that is like kind to suggest to people, I would say Camus. Otherwise, I would obviously say Georges Bataille, but that is very specific philosophy.
That's true. Well, mine, thanks for asking. Last summer, for the first time, read anything by Jorge Luis Borges.
Yes.
And I was really, really floored. Amazing stuff.
Oh, your tip's better than mine. Yeah. No, yeah.
Really amazing author. We both agree. If you're thinking of what to read next, go ahead and buy yourself a bundle of stories by Borges, and it will be amazing. You will love it.
It is really, really good. any specific story that you read that you would say, and it's allowed to be the Aleph, because that is the one that I would.
Yeah.
That was my first Borges story.
Oh yeah, and the short story that I think about the most from the bundle that I read, which is just called Labyrinths, I believe, is called The Circular Ruins. I would really, really recommend that one. I'm wondering if I'm remembering the name of the story right, because I read it in a bundle, so the names kind of fall out a little bit. Which is about a man who sits in a cave and spends all of his time trying to sleep as much as possible and dream up a man, of a person, like in as many details as possible. And and he like spends the first month to just trying to imagine like and properly dream of his heartbeat and really have it. And he starts expanding and like he's building this bit by bit.
So moving away from our literary anvil for the final time, we're going to leave you with Awee reading some key fragments from Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which will close out the episode perfectly. And we'll see you next time.
Jean-Paul Sartre, Being and Nothingness, an essay on phenomenological ontology. Sartre begins, on freedom. Man does not exist first in order to be free. Subsequently, there is no difference between the being of man and his being free. Well, first statement. Anxiety is the mode of being of freedom, as consciousness of being. And now Sartre tries to show what this means. And he shows very everyday situations. There exist concretely alarm clocks, signboards, tax forms, policemen, so many guard rails against anguish, dread, angst. But as soon as the enterprise is held at a distance from me, as soon as I'm referred to myself, I discover myself suddenly as the one who gives its meaning to the alarm clock. I had the same experience when I first started studying here. I still remember the first day of my college. I woke up, alarm clock, I had to go to class. I was living in a terrible, terrible housing in Krooswijk. I could imagine how people could live there. So the alarm clock went. I said, I have to go to university now. But I also realized I don't have to go to university anymore because I'm not obliged to go to university. Nobody's going to call my mom and dad. I don't have to go. I didn't go, of course. First moment of liberty in my life, perhaps. Never regretted it. So it's us who give meaning to the alarm clock. It's you. When the alarm clock goes, you can't say, oh, I got to go to work. No, you decide that you have to go to work. The one who by a signboard forbids himself to walk on a flower bed or on the lawn. The one from whom the boss's order borrows its urgency. The one who decides the interest of the book which he is writing. The one, finally, who makes the values exist in order to determine his actions by their demands. And this is what anxiety learns us. In anxiety, I emerge alone. So this is Heidegger, but then really close to what it's really all about. In anxiety, I emerge alone, confronting the unique and original project which constitutes my being. All the barriers, all the guardrails collapse. The same as with Heidegger. Everything falls apart in anxiety. Nihilated, not annihilated, nihilated by the consciousness of my freedom. I do not, nor can I have recourse to any value against the fact that it is I who sustain values in being. It is us, you and me, who decide what counts as a value and what not. Nothing can ensure me against myself, cut off from the world and from my essence by this nothingness which I am. I have to realize the meaning of the world and of my essence. I make my decision concerning them, without justification and without excuse. So we are condemned to be free. We cannot not be free. I can say, I'm not free. I'm in a prison. You're still free in a prison. It's up to you to decide what that means to be in prison. Oh, I'm so sad. Oh, it's unfair. I shouldn't be in prison. Or good, the thing that I'm in prison. I'm a terrible person. We are all responsible for the way we interpret ourselves and our world. And for Sartre, this means that we are not only absolutely free, so there's no limits in freedom, but we're also absolutely responsible. And here it becomes very difficult. But maybe Sartre is right. The essential on responsibility. The essential consequence of our earlier remarks is that man, being condemned to be free, carries the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. In this sense, the responsibility, 3 lines below, of the for itself is overwhelming, since he is the one by whom it happens that there is a world. And then he sketches that there is a coefficient. I might say, well, these are things that happen to me, and this is too much for me. It's me. It's I who decide whether something is too much for me. Everything has meaning only in and through my project. Therefore, it's senseless to think of complaining. Everything that happens to me happens through me. Second consequence, everything which happens to me is mine. This is Heidegger's Gemeinigkeit, the mineness, but then really understood. And Sartre says even, sometimes we speak of a non-human situation. Dit is onmenselijk. We are so appalled by something that we call it onmenselijk, inhuman. And Sartre says, it's ridiculous. That is a human decision to call something inhuman. We have to understand that it's all up to us how we interpret things. And he even says, there's two phrases in this text that might make you very angry. There are no accidents in life. There are no accidents in life. What Sartre means is, it is us who decide whether something is an accident or stupid fate, or maybe a punishment by the gods, or maybe a challenge to change your life. It's up to us to decide. And then comes a phrase which is much discussed and even appalled me when I was a young student reading Sartre. He quotes Jules Romain, who wrote, "In war, there are no innocent victims." That is one of the most atrocious sentences in the book, being entire. In war, there are no innocent victims. Of course, if you would, if you consider, we all know this iconic picture of this little Roma girl in a livestock wagon being transported to Auschwitz, looking at the photographer with these big begging eyes. And how on earth could anyone not call her an innocent victim? So that's the problem with this phrase. But what Sartre is trying to say is, as soon as someone says, I am a victim, I'm an innocent victim, there's something very wrong happening. So it's more about the people who say they are innocent victims. The people who, and this is very actual in today's political situation, the people who say we are victims. It's their responsibility to call themselves a victim. They could decide otherwise. They could have other interpretations. It's always your own responsibility. You choose yourself from day to day. Sartre says, I am responsible for everything. In fact, except for my very responsibility. For I am not the foundation of my being. This is what Heidegger called guilt in the most ontological sense. I am not the foundation of my being. But I'm responsible for everything except for my very responsibility. But I have to be responsible. Because I can flee my responsibilities, but then I'm responsible for fleeing my responsibilities. There is no way we can flee, we can live without this constant responsibility. To make myself passive in the world, to refuse to act upon things and upon others, is still to choose myself. And suicide is one mode among others of being in the world. And in the end, he says, in the text, the one who realizes in anxiety his condition as being thrown into our responsibility, thrown into a responsibility, is no longer anything but a freedom which perfectly reveals itself and whose being resides in this very relation. But, and he pointed that out early in the text, most of the time we flee anxiety in bad faith. So before the break, so this is the situation. We are absolutely free. Our condition is not that we are sometimes free and sometimes not free. We're always free. Even in a prison, I am free to interpret that situation in any way. I'm also responsible. Everything that happens to me is mine. But I'm usually fleeing away from this. And Sartre calls this bad faith. Mauvais foi, very famous. This is an ethics that he's writing. It's a kind of ethics, because it doesn't tell you exactly how it works. So either I embrace my freedom and my responsibility, or I flee away from it, and then I'm in bad faith. Why is it bad faith? Because I'm using my freedom to deny my freedom. I'm using the fact that I exist in trying to convince myself and others that I don't really exist. I'm a victim. With my back, you can't expect me to go to war with my back. So you use freedom to deny it. That is bad faith. Very important. Think about that. Preferably for the rest of your life. We're constantly doing this. This is das Man, but then much, much more personalized. It's much more focused on our real existence. This is what the position I can use my freedom to deny it, and I can use my freedom to acknowledge it. These are the two situations in which we, according to Sartre, are always moving. This is authenticity and inauthenticity reread with much more, I think, much more meaning for everyday life. Okay, we'll have a short break and then we'll talk about intersubjectivity, which is even worse than everything that I said so far. You will be depressed tonight, but you will be better tomorrow.